Good afternoon. I'm Gia Smith, the president of Franciscan's Political Science Association. On behalf of the association, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today to speak on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Dr. Daniel Kempton. Dr. Kempton received his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame and his MA and PhD from the University of Illinois in political science. At Northern Illinois University, he served as the chairman of the Department of Political Science for 7 years. Dr. Kempton is Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Franciscan, as well as Political Science Professor here. Dr. Kempton is widely published, including his books, Soviet Policy in South Africa, The National Liberation Movement Connection, and a co-edited volume of Unity or Separation, Center-Periphery Relations in the Former Soviet Union. Dr. Kempton has received numerous research grants and 12 fellowships, including twice the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship to Rhodes University in South Africa and to Tver University in Russia. In addition to his books, Dr. Kempton has also published articles, book chapters, case studies, and book reviews in journals such as Pew Case Studies in International Affairs, International Journal in Public Administration, and Russian Review, to just name a few. Without further ado, Political Science Association would like to welcome Dr. Kempton.
Thank you, Gia, and thanks for coming today. I wish it was a more pleasant topic to talk about, but it is certain. Let me start with Putin's motives and what it's about. I'm really going to be talking about sets of motives in 3 different areas. The first set of motives, I think, are a series or a set of cultural factors. That one of Putin's primary arguments of his entire presidency, his presidencies, I should say, since he was president and left the presidency, put his friend in charge of the presidency, and then conveniently came back when he had served a term out of the presidency. But one of the things he's always argued is that there was a great loss in the creation of the Soviet Union. He's always argued, he is reported to have said something to the effect that one of the greatest geostrategic tragedies of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That statement is sometimes taken to mean, well, he was a KGB colonel, he's still a KGB, he's still a believer in communism. I do not believe that is the case. I do believe he's a believer in Russian great power status. So this cultural argument, I think, is quite important to him. He traces back that great power status to an early state called Kievan Rus, which was founded in the late 800s. It was a Varangian state, meaning it was founded by the voyagers or the Varangians from the peoples of Norway and Sweden, basically the Vikings as we'd say it today. The center of that state was really in Kiev, which was the capital of it. So it's often called Kievan Rus, Rus referring to the people, Kiev referring to the seat of it. What's interesting about this map is this is a little bit later. I think this map is about 1011. It shows the principal princedoms of Kievan Rus. You will note one admission. I wrote Kiev and ne Moskva, not Moscow. Moscow doesn't even exist in the Kievan state, but Putin wants to claim that he is the successor state to Kiev, and that's very important to him. The Kiev actually is the center of this great culture. By the way, it's the largest and one of the more populous states throughout the 10th and 11th century. So it really is a great center of early European culture, power, military might, linguistics, lots of different ways, and that's why both countries are trying to trace their way back to Kievan Rus. One of the more important parts of Kievan Rus is this gentleman here. It's kind of funny because I think most of you know the president of Ukraine is Vladimir Zelensky, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. It's the same name, basically, and both of them find their way back. One is Ukrainian, one is the Russian pronunciation. But the most famous Vladimir is this, Vladimir, who was in some ways the founder, although it already existed, of the Kievan Rus. He is the one who made it great and in many ways very important. He is the one who Christifies it. He converts to Christianity According to the stories, he sent out emissaries to all the different religions, heard from Islam, didn't like Islam. One of the problems with Islam is you couldn't drink or eat pork. I agree with him on this point. Christianity, however, you could drink, you could eat pork, you could also marry the Princess of Constantinople, the great Byzantine Empire, and he did so, and that created the Christianization of the Slavic world in particular, and he was the leader of that. This is critical because I argued that Putin is not a communist recreated, he is a great power Russian nationalist, and he sees the heritage of Russia tying back to Kievan Rus, and Russia being what is sometimes called the Third Rome. What he means by that is Rome was the original Rome, of course, but when Rome got corrupt and began to fall, Byzantium became the center of Christianity. When Kievan Rus falls, he argues that Moscow and the Patriarchy of Moscow becomes the center. In modern times, this will become very controversial once again, partially because Orthodoxy has a tradition of what is called autocephalous, self-headed churches, and what that literally means is usually the church goes with the state, and there is a different Orthodox church and a different independent bishop in each of the major countries of Orthodoxy up until 1917, basically there was one Orthodox church. 1917, a first one breaks away. Well, there's actually an earlier one tied to Rome, but a second one breaks away, claiming Ukrainian independence. It happened again more recently in that the Orthodox Church in 2018 in Ukraine, the most significant one, declared its or requested its independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. In Putin's world, this was a big deal because it undermines the claim to the legitimacy to all of this cultural heritage. The Tsarist state also saw this as a point of continuity between Kievan Rus and the Russian state. Peter the Great helped take part of Ukraine back from what was at the time the Ottomans. Catherine the Great also takes part back. She takes back what was called the Crimean Khanate, and she actually refers to the people that she seized back as Novorossiyski, New Russians, and tries to make the argument that this is essentially the same people. So this question of Ukrainian identity, which we hear being played out with Putin's claims and the Ukrainian denials, is not a new question. This is an old question. Ukraine existed as a state intermittently from about the 1200s on. At some times it's under the control of Poland, at the another time under the control of the Teutonic Knights, at other times under Lithuanian, and other times under Russian control. So different parts of Ukraine are under different controls at different points in history. What really happens, if I can go back a bit, prior to the Mongol invasion, Kiev is clearly the cultural, the political, the military center of this area. But Kiev was one of the last areas to break away from the Mongols. Moscow actually receives its centrality when it begins breaking away from the Mongol invaders. It's one of the earlier and one of the central ones. In fact, Moscow and Tver were the two princedoms that broke away first. The symbol of Tver, where I used to work, was an empty throne, meaning the throne should have been there, but Moscow stole it, as far as they were concerned. So Moscow then emerges after the after the Mongols as the center of the empire, as the center of Slavic, particularly Russian culture. I think that's very much part of the issue. The other part of the issue is that if you can look down here, we're not going to get a very good thing of it, but there's a long Russian-Ukrainian border. Over the centuries, this border's moved back and forth. And in fact, Crimea down here, you'll often read in the news, was given back to Ukraine, but to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic by Nikita Khrushchev, who was actually born in Ukraine, as part of a gift celebrating an anniversary. So the border has been very fluid. What that means is when you look at the eastern half of Ukraine, it tends to be more Russian-speaking and more ethnic Russian. And it's important you make a distinction because those are not the same. There are Ukrainians who are primarily Russian speakers. There are ethnic Russians who are primarily Ukrainian speaking, depending on where in the country they live, what school system they went to, etc. But again, there's this whole cultural argument that's very important to President Putin to say Russia ought to be a great power because they've always been a great power. They've been this long-term source of stability and history. The second, I think, critical factor for Russia in wanting control of Ukraine is geostrategic policy. I think many of you know the traditional argument. If you look at Russia, either the Russian Federated Republic as it existed, or even the whole Soviet Union, one of the things you note is most of the water border is in the north. Russia didn't have warm water ports. The one traditional, sometimes exception, was Sevastopol and the Crimean Peninsula. So that was always very important to them. I think that can be overemphasized. A second argument I would make, and in some ways more important in Russian history and Russian understanding of the world. Let me start by saying something about America. We have a very strange view of history in America because our history is very strange. If you look at American history, think of all those times America has been invaded and all the major threats to America. Okay, 1812, well, sort of, maybe a big deal. They burned the Capitol. That was really mean, nasty. But, you know, not massive invasions. Our borders are the Atlantic and the Pacific on the east and west. Then we're faced with our great rivals, Canada and Mexico. So we tend to have a very unusual view of war, of threat, of history. Conversely, if you think about the Russian view of history, it's a history of invasion. Some of those other peoples, countries that have invaded are the Mongols, the Teutonic Knights, the Ottoman Empire, the Polish Empire, the Kingdom of Lithuania, the Swedish Kingdom, France, America, Britain, Germany twice, Japan once. I mean, it's a long, long history of invasions of other countries putting troops into Russia. One of the problems is Russian geography. There's a long time argument that your foreign policy is often affected by your geography. Russia has some fairly high mountain ranges, but they're all along the eastern coast. From Moscow and certainly from Kiev to the west is a large European plain. The Ural Mountains, most of the Russian population lives west of the Ural Mountains, and the invading ally goes all the way to Berlin, essentially. So Russia's been this subject of frequent invasions. Russia's always had a problem of how do I be secure? One modern historian essentially said the Russian response has been the Lombardy Doctrine. No, they didn't know the Green Bay coach, but they adopted a very similar policy. If you've studied the Green Bay Packers, their philosophy was ours. The best defense is a good offense. And what the Russians have historically done is make sure they can control some of the areas around them. If they've got no natural borders, you've got to control your neighbors. And that's what Russian history is, a long attempt to try and control some of the neighbors. Russians themselves refer to, so in here is the Russian Republic. When the Soviet Union fell apart, essentially the Soviet republics, the ones that say SSR, became separate countries. There wasn't a whole lot of logic to it. That was just the way the Soviet Union was designed. Borders had shifted back and forth. But when Putin talks, one of the arguments he's trying to make is that these borders don't make any sense, that they were a fiction created by some of the Soviet leaders. In many ways, he's right about that. Russians, when they categorize their foreign policy, talk about blizhnie zarubezhye, which refers to the near abroad. The near abroad, some people in America talk about a sphere of influence. Well, in some ways that works. There are times in American history where we say, stay out of our hemisphere, that the European powers should not be involved in here. But this is much more permanent, and it's much more distinctive in saying these countries that are part of the near abroad, they're not really separate. They're not really entire autonomous. By virtue of their history, by virtue of their geography, Russia has a special role to play in all of these countries. So when Putin's making these arguments, he's not treating Ukraine or even Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia like any other country. He's saying these are in some ways, by definition of geography, by definition of history, culture, our area. So it's like spheres of influence. It's like the Monroe Doctrine, but it's much more rooted in history. It's much more affirmed. It's much more a part of the Russian psyche. The third argument I would make is economic. And sometimes we started talking about this at the beginning of the war. It's disappeared very quickly. But if you look at Ukraine, has always been very important to the Russian Tsarist economy, to the Soviet economy. This map doesn't show it, but one of the main waterways, the Dnieper River, comes down just to the west of the Crimean Peninsula. That was a major trade track for the Russian-Soviet economy. It was also important because of the natural resources. Eastern Ukraine is a big, eastern northern is a big coal manufacturing, sort of the western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, eastern Ohio part of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine is also the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, which makes it all the more ironic that Stalin once starved them out and took away their grain during the Holodomor. So this is very critical to the Russian economy. In the last 20 years, it's become even more critical. Why? Because Russia is now making a huge percentage of its foreign earnings through the sale of natural gas and oil. Basically, Germany heats itself with Russian gas. Pretty much most of the states around it do as well. Germany gave up on nuclear power. Germany gave up on coal, which it used to buy from Poland. So many of the states in Western Europe are totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. That also means the Russian economy is almost entirely dependent on selling these products. One of the main, couple of the main routes for Russian gas, this is one of the old routes. There was another one that went north directly through Ukraine. Russia was always upset that Ukraine said, hey, you're shipping your oil and gas across our country. You're maintaining pipelines in our country. You should give us a cut of this. And by the way, we shouldn't pay the same amount that Germany pays for your oil and gas. So there were times where the Ukrainians literally held the Russians hostage and said, lower the price, we won't pay the higher price. If you want the rest of your gas to go to Germany, you'll sell it to us at a lower price. Russia didn't like that. So part of this is Russia knows it needs this natural gas, needs to sell it to the West. Some studies say up to 35–40% of the Russian GDP or the Russian budget is created by oil and gas sales. So essentially, cut our budget by a third. Imagine what that does to the American economy. If Russia can't sell oil and gas, that's a large percent of its annual national budget. A second thing I want you to note on this map is the Black Sea, we believe, is one of the world's next great oil and gas reserves. The Caspian on the other side is already being developed. Already, this is where this gas route is. Russia recently formed a new route to go through. TUR means Turkey. So it's going through the Black Sea, but not through Ukrainian waters anymore. This is the Ukrainian exclusive zone, the Romanian, and the Russian zone here on the far right. But what we're also learning is that where are the big oil and gas finds? Well, look at that. They're all along the Ukrainian coast. So these oil and gas fields are either A, huge competition for Russian foreign sales, or B, the excess product for Russian sales to increase their economy. So again, I don't think these are entirely separate motives, but the last thing Russia wants is Ukraine developing all of these oil and gas fields that are technically in Ukrainian waters. And at the end of this, we'll look at a battle map of where we are, and it corresponds very closely to where the oil and gas fields. Russia is pushing very hard, not only for Kyiv, but also for the southern route along the Russian-speaking zone. So you can almost tie their battle plans to what I think Putin is trying to achieve. So for a variety of reasons, geostrategic, cultural, and economic, Russia has always felt that it needs to control. President Putin has argued from his very beginning as president that part of their greatness is controlling, that the way to Russia's great power status, which I think is his driving force, is to make sure he controls some of the near abroad and particularly Ukraine. Let me switch a little bit over to the Ukraine. Let me start by looking at American foreign policy in a couple of different ways. I'm shifted to that second question now. How do I assess the American response to this? Well, first of all, some people think Russia has just recently gotten involved, and others say, no, 2014 they took Crimea. 2014 they did this. In 2004, this man was the main Ukrainian candidate for the presidency of Ukraine. This cup has his name on it, Yushchenko. This is from what's called the Orange Revolution. He was running for president, and suddenly he broke out with this horrible, horrible disease, which they later found out was dioxin poisoning. Surprise, surprise. He's recovered significantly from that, but his face will never be the same. He never died from that. As Dr. Doyle was saying before the lecture started, the Russians really love their poisons, don't they? Yes, they do. I just learned today, I'm a big Chelsea soccer fan. The owner of the Chelsea soccer team is a former Russian oligarch, former Russian governor. They just found out today, during his time in Kyiv, trying to help facilitate negotiations, he was poisoned. Shocking. I wonder who did that. I think we'll pretty soon find out that it was the Russians once again. So let's walk softly but carry a big stick. That means calling your enemy a, quote, a peer thug, a killer, a butcher, a brute and a bully, a murderous dictator, a war criminal, and saying this man cannot remain in power essentially closes the off-ramp. We need, unless we're going to have some way of taking Putin out, which I don't believe we do, he doesn't even sit within 20 feet of anyone else anymore. If we're going to try and take him down, that's one thing, but we really need to negotiate an out for him. And to me, I think all of us should be calling him names. All of us should be hating him. But it's not really a good thing for the president to do, because the president, like presidents before him, may somehow have to deal with a Putin in the future. And to negotiate with him, you shouldn't really be calling him names, especially names. They're true, but still don't do it, is what I'd say. Thanks, Bob.